The Cold War pitted two of the world's strongest nations against each other in a bitter battle of superiority. The Democratic United States of America and the Communist Soviet Union were in every type of competition that could prove one more powerful than the other. There was a race to prove military strength, political and economic success, and technological advancement. Eventually, this dramatic affair was taken to the stars. The biggest question of the late 1950s was, who would send a man to the moon first? The space race was effectively a fight of scientific progression. The looming threat of nuclear warfare had been weaved into the lives of people around the globe, and it was decided that whoever had the ability to explore the realms of space at their discretion also had the means to potentially destroy a country.
The Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite in October of 1957. It was known as Sputnik, which meant Russian for traveller, and it was the first man-made object to be put into orbit. The Americans, having had a lengthy history of historical exploration, saw this as a major threat, especially as the missile used to launch the satellite held enough power to start a nuclear war if the Soviets wanted to. And so the space race began. And in 1958, America launched their own satellite, the Explorer 1, which was designed under the supervision of Wernher von Braun. Shortly after this, President Dwight Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, which started to place tension on the already tense space race. The Soviets were the first to land a probe on the moon in 1959 with Luna 2. They were also the first to send a man into orbit around the Earth in April of 1961. The first American to orbit the Earth was none other than John Glenn on the Friendship 7 in the year of 1962. NASA always seemed to be one step behind the Soviets. However, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy rekindled the hopes of his nation with one swift speech in Texas.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Kennedy's speech spoke of something that had never been attempted, and at the time, NASA had only completed 4 manned space missions, with the longest lasting less than 5 hours. A trip to the moon would span over 8 days and would require a rocket with 250 times as much fuel. To make things more complicated, the mission would require something brand new, a separate lander. This lander would need to be able to detach itself from the spaceship, navigate itself to a suitable landing area, land safely, relaunch, and make its way back to the mothership before returning to Earth. And then Apollo 11 was built.
3 of the 5 training landers were destroyed in crashes prior to the launch. Therefore, any errors in space would result in the deaths of 2, if not all 3 astronauts. If this were to happen, a protocol was put in place where all communication would be cut off between NASA and the astronauts on board, namely Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. This would allow the astronauts to decide whether they'd take their own lives or wait for their oxygen supply to run out. President Nixon would then present to the nation about the bravery and sacrifice of these influential figures in order to further the knowledge and possibilities for mankind. Fortunately for the United States, this was not the case, and they effectively won the space race. As Neil Armstrong famously said,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind,"
which created world history and ultimately unified the nation. The Soviets made 4 failed attempts to launch a lunar landing craft between 1969 and 1972, including a spectacular launch pad explosion in July of 1969.
2500 тоннами керосина и кислорода. Мощность взрыва составила 5000 тонн в тротиловом эквиваленте. Стартовая позиция была полностью разрушена.
They never did manage to catch up with NASA after this. From the beginning to the end, the public of America was captivated by the race to space. Each new development from NASA and the Soviet space program was heavily exposed throughout national media. This frenzy of interest was further encouraged by the new medium of television. Armstrong and Aldrin came to be seen as the ultimate American heroes, with earthbound men and women seeming to enjoy living vicariously through them. The space race is so intriguing because the Soviets had so many firsts. Practically every first except the one that counted, which of course was the moon landing. And so the Americans have gone down in history for being space entrepreneurs, when in reality they were motivated by a need to be ahead of their opposition. Realistically, without the push from the space race and being in direct rivalry with the Soviets, space exploration could have become a priority much later on. What this demonstrates about the nature of the Cold War, however, is that it really was at its heart a fight to be the best. The newfound patriotism that was born from the space race managed to distract many from the aftershock of the Second World War. However, ultimately, the greatest influence the space race had on the Cold War was the invention of the intercontinental ballistic missile. After the Cold War ended, Russia and America collaborated on many space operations together, including the International Space Station.